I would like to introduce Mr. Avermaete to the audience, trying to outline just his main achievements. Currently the chair of History and Theory of Urban Design at the ETH in Zurich. He also served at Delft University of Technology for a long period, first as an associate and then as a full professor until 2012. He was trained as an architect in the University of Leuven, where he also obtained a PhD in the history and theory of architecture. And during his career, he has held several visiting professorships, amongst others, at the Politecnico di Milano, Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and the University of Copenhagen. He's one of the main voices in the editorial board of OA's Journal for Architecture, a journal that has been steering the international debate with specific calls for the last 20 years. Previously, he was also part of the editorial team of the Journal of Architectural Education and the Architecture in the Netherlands yearbook. On top of an intense editorial activity of his own, with more than a dozen published volumes, he has extensively engaged collaboration with others, having contributed with 25 book chapters and an endless list of articles and conference papers. If impact measurement platforms are for once useful, maybe the figure of 1,200 sites he holds in Google Scholar can give a precise picture of his prolific production. His research topics are focused on 20th century European architecture, more specifically the interwar and post-war periods, giving special attention to structuralism, Team 10, and the construction of welfare state. Also, issues regarding the common, the public, and the urban have been addressed in his most recent research. Criticality being an unavoidable concept for a conference called Critic Hall, we are sure that his lecture today will point out new directions to update architectural discourse towards a more concrete and operative field of action. Thank you for joining us, and please welcome Mr. Avermaete.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvia, for I think a very, very generous introduction. What I will do right now is to try to share my screen. Is this correct? Do you see my screen right now? Yeah, the full screen.
Yes,
thank you.
yes, perfectly.
So first of all, thank you to the organizing team for inviting me. It's a great pleasure, and I would also say an honor after 2 days of discussing indeed the questions of, amongst others, criticality, as you were saying, to be able to indeed in some kind of way try to conclude this with the keynote lecture. I'm promising you that it will be a rather compact lecture, but indeed a lecture in which I will try to get across an intellectual frame that might, let's say, be of interest to you. The title of my talk of today is Architecture Talks Back on the Impossibilities of a Critical Architectural Project. And I'm taking here talking back as one of these comparative forms of reasoning, as one form of dialectics, we could say, relating this, of course, very closely to the theme of this conference. Talking back is usually not named as a quality of architecture. It belongs to the realm of upbringing, and is often referred to as the moment where the child reaches a degree of autonomy that allows for a radical response to the statements of its parents. The child finds itself in a state of disagreement with the parental views and thus utters counter-arguments. This reaction is generally described as talking back, and is from the adult's perspective alternatively considered as an occurrence of inappropriate behavior or an instance of emancipation, but always as a very critical moment in the parent-child relationship. Starting from this capacity to talk back, I will try to connect in my lecture of today the theme of this conference, which in the call for papers was defined as the idea of a critique based on duality, to the field of architectural design and its critical capacity. Critical positions in architectural culture have been widely studied in scholarship over the last years. I think, as we all know, a broad series of conferences, publications, and team issues of journals have been devoted to the mutual and reciprocal relations between critical and architectural practices. In the last decades, we can discover in architectural discourse certainly very different positions. While some have maintained that they take, as you can see on the screen here, super critical positions and have claimed an important societal role for architects and for urban designers, simultaneously also another debate has emerged, a debate that took a bit of another stance, a debate in North America, but also in Europe, where people have started to argue that we have entered a post-critical era. Essays like Notes Around the Doppler Effect and Other Moods of Modernism by Sarah Whiting and Robert Somol have engendered an entire school of architects and theorists that maintain that criticality promotes an architecture of stunt creativity and retrogression, as they call it. And these post-critics instead suggest that architecture should leave its ambition to be critical, should leave that ambition at all, and rather investigate into intelligence, projection, innovation, and provision. So one of the questions that I would like to ask today, what is indeed this possibility of constructing a critical architectural project in this landscape, in this architectural culture in which very, very contradictory stances seem to be taken? So the questions that emerge are, what about the possibility for constructing a critical architectural project? Is the notion of critical architecture a sheer rhetorical figure that merely has to cover the architect's reduced role within a society that is increasingly defined by the movement of capital and labor? Does it represent maybe one of the last convulsions of a discipline that is about to lose all of its impact? Or is there more at hand? And can there be something as a genuinely critical architectural project within our contemporary condition? That's really the question that I would like to ask tonight. To start answering some of these questions, and only partially answering them, obviously, but to start answering some of these questions on the critical capacity of contemporary architectural design, it is worthwhile, and that will be my main line of thinking tonight, to return to the notion of typological criticism that was introduced by the Italian critic Manfredo Tafuri. Introduced in his book Teoria e Storia dell'Architettura in 1968, translated and might be known by many of you as Theories and History of Architecture, Tafuri refers to a particular approach of criticism by design that he discerns most clearly in the architectural culture of the 1960s. So actually he discerns that criticism by design in the architectural culture that he at that moment was part of, we can say. He recognizes typological criticism in such a diverse projects as Allison and Peter Smithson's Golden Lane project for London, obviously, for the Coventry area. In Giancarlo De Carlo's master plan for Urbino in Italy. In Carlo Aimonino's and Aldo Rossi's proposals for the Galleratese neighborhood. These are all projects, as you can see, from the mid 50s and the 1960s, but also in the investigations of the relation between town structure and infrastructure in the so-called Centro Direzionale by Aldo Rossi, Vittorio Gregotti, and Guido Canella, and also in the city center of Cumbernauld by Geoffrey Copcutt. All of these are considered as instances of typological criticism by Tafuri. This broad spectrum, and we may say so that this is a broad spectrum of design approaches, Tafuri calls criticism because first and foremost, they all represent a clear position vis-à-vis the body of architectural knowledge that has been established throughout history. So this relation to history is very important for Tafuri. Instead of regarding architectural design as an invention ex nihilo, out of nothing, these different architects depart, in Tafuri's opinion, from an in-depth understanding of the stock of historical solutions in order to define new models, systems, and approaches. In other words, they see contemporary design in dialogue with the history of architecture and the history of urban design. And here you see this, let's say, dialectical idea already emerging. Tafuri goes on and he argues that these 20th century architects, like the Smithsons, like Giancarlo De Carlo, and like Rossi, are part of a much longer tradition, a tradition which he calls an Illuminist tradition, and in which he traces back to the 18th century. A tradition that, in the opinion of Tafuri, reasons about design by establishing juxtapositions of images and of realities. As examples of this Illuminist tradition, Tafuri refers amongst others to the work of Caspar Philips and his studies of Amsterdam, in which the typologies and the morphologies of various canals are confronted in a single drawing, as you can see here. Another example that he names are the confrontation of garden designs by Jacques-François Blondel in La distribution des maisons de plaisance of 1737. And also here in this book, projects are juxtaposed to make an argument about design. A last example that Tafuri is naming a lot of these examples, particularly in the footnotes, the long footnotes that Tafuri always have. A last example that he's naming are the juxtaposition of theater plans in Pierre Pat's Essai sur l'architecture théâtrale of 1782, which are considered by Tafuri as expressions of a dialectic way of thinking, in which projects are juxtaposed as a way to critically argue about design approaches. In this Illuminist tradition, Tafuri observes a way of reasoning that is based on the confrontation and comparison of architectural forms, proposals, and projects. He underlines that this type of thinking relies, and I'm quoting him here, on the dialectic inherent in the dynamic and changeable character of artistic studies. So this capacity to combine and dialectically confront, indeed, several what he calls artistic studies. Such a way of reasoning, Tafuri sees reappearing in the 1960s. For instance, in the work of Italian architects like Nathan Ernesto Rogers, and here on the screen, Guido Canella. In Canella's work, for instance, new design proposals for theaters were understood to be in dialogue with existing historical theater typologies, and thus as a critical reaction to the existing stock of architectural knowledge. I think that you can see that from the, let's say, the collages, as it were, that I have on the screen here. Out of the same vein, Tafuri claims that 20th century architects, as Alison and Peter Smithson, Giancarlo De Carlo, and Carlo Aimonino, in spite of their large theoretical and stylistic differences, share an attitude in which they base their architectural and urban attitudes on on a firm dialogue with modern masters, such as Bruno Taut, August Klein, and Ludwig Hilbersheimer. To be more precise, Tafuri claims that these architects develop their contemporary positions as a critique of the body of know-how that the modern movement in architecture has brought to the fore during the 1920s and the 1930s. Remarkable, I think, for this conference is that this critique is not formulated by means of a critical essay, an image, a cartoon, or a collage, but rather through the very design of an architectural project. Hence, Tafuri, do you still see my screen? Because my second screen is doing something strange. Do you still see my screen at the moment? Yeah, okay, good. Hence, Tafuri suggests that the work of Geoffrey Copcott on Cumbernauld Newtown, to the right here on the screen, should be understood as having a firm relation to the earlier investigations of how to create centrality in the urban territory by Hilbersheimer, for instance, which you see to the left-hand side of the screen. For instance, in this City in the Landscape project of 1944. So always what Tafuri is suggesting is indeed this way of thinking, this way of reasoning, which always starts from this comparative confrontation, let's say. That's what I'm trying to get across. Tafuri points out that a project such as Combernauld can maintain such a critical relation to the recent past because the design thinking proceeds by means of a very characteristic entity, type or typology. That's the way that design thinking proceeds. For Tafuri, architectural and urban design encompasses the definition of spatial, material, and functional articulations, and thus results in a particular type. Moreover, he argues that the use of a particular type has the capacity to relate to historical approaches, that's one, but simultaneously, because of its transformative properties, can be understood as a response to contemporary problems and conditions. So this double capacity, that's what Tafuri is interested in. An architectural type can, according to Tafuri, also play a role on various scale levels and can be reinterpreted from different angles. Its size can be reduced to the study of a single object, he's saying, and immediately afterwards it can stretch out to consider that very same object in its urban thematic. It can touch on brand new themes formulated on a pure experimental basis. So that's what Tafuri is saying. The capacity to move between history and the contemporary condition, the capacity to move between scales, that's he's saying as well. Hence, Tafuri claims that with the adaptation of the architectural type, not only a concrete design assignment is addressed, but also a criticism is uttered towards the existing body of architectural knowledge on this particular type. In addition, the confrontation of a particular type with a specific program or a particular context can result in symbiosis, contradiction, or ambiguity, and thus also install a critical relation. Tafuri claims that it's characteristic for typological criticism, this typological criticism, that projects reach beyond solution finding for a program, a context, or a situation, while at the same time relying strongly on concrete conditions and on concrete situations. For Tafuri, hence Tafuri claims that indeed typological criticism has a sort of double capacity. A concrete condition can be addressed, as you can see on the screen, but at the same time there is the possibility of criticizing an existing body of architectural knowledge. That is really what he's trying to suggest, and I think is a very compelling suggestion, let's say, a very compelling understanding of the criticality of architectural design. As an example, Tafuri, for instance, points out that when Ellison and Peter Smithson propose an innovative hybrid urban structure for the Mehringplatz in Berlin, as you can see here, they go beyond a simple response to the current conditions and requirements of infrastructures. And they do propose, they do something different. On the one hand, they make a clear reference to known modernist typologies, such as the Unité d'Habitation, as you see on the screen here. The Smithsons propose a project that in some kind of way is critical of this knowledge as embedded in the Unité d'Habitation, while at the same time creating a new sense of urbanity in the very city center of Berlin, a new project for public space of the city, a project for the public space that they would later call a charged void. For Tafuri, the essence of typological criticism resides in this double capacity to complement the existing urban condition on the one hand and criticize that existing urban condition, while complementing and criticizing the existing stock of architectural knowledge. Realism in the choice of samples and unprejudged experimentalism of the formulation of new models. That is how Tafuri describes this capacity. Indeed, the complex combination of formulating new approaches for a real urban situation while relying on the stock of knowledge that is available in architectural history seems to be a core characteristic of typological criticism. And that is indeed what binds a proposal for the Mehringplatz by the Smithsons to another example given by Tafuri, namely this so-called Locomotiva 2 project by Rossi and his team for a competition in 1962 in Torino. Also in this project, Tafuri discovers, on the one hand, a critical dialogue, we could say, with the modern masters and the knowledge that they have generated. For instance, here in the proposal of Ludwig Hilbersheimer's high-rise city of 1924. And at the same time, indeed, a critical stance and a critical dialogue to the historical Italian city. To the left-hand side on the screen here, you see how this Centro Direzionale was indeed planned in close vicinity to historical Italian cities. And so for Tafuri, it's also a reaction and a criticism of that historical city and its capacity to absorb automobility. Centro Direzionale is, in other words, both a criticism of modern architectural knowledge and of the urban condition in post-war Italy. That is what Tafuri is suggesting to us. Typological criticism, in that sense, can be said to open two alleys of criticism. On the one hand, it is concerned with the potential of particular historical architectural approaches. It evaluates the performance of particular complex or simple typologies, of specific multivalent or monovalent urban composition, of distinct systems that are open or closed to time and space. Typological criticism seems to evaluate the functioning of these architectural type models and approaches through inserting them in a particular condition and context. On the other hand, typological criticism critically investigates the urban situation that it encounters. Projects question the urban situation in which they intervene. They evaluate its potential to accommodate certain uses or to play a certain role within the wider urban territory. Hence, Tafuri points out that this type of criticism is essentially urban in character. It emerges from its interaction with existing and real urban situations. Tafuri also maintains that typological criticism proceeds to the modes of architectural design, let's say. That is an important aspect. Do you still see my screen? Yeah, the full screen still? Okay, because things are a bit going wrong here. Is it still okay? Yeah.
Yes, it's okay.
Now I don't see my screen any longer, so that's a bit of a problem. I'm sorry, I'm having a little technical problem here. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to retake the sharing again. I'm sorry for this little intermezzo. Very sorry about that. So I'm going to try to share my screen again and then see if I can get this on again. I'm sorry. Do you see my full screen right now? Yeah. Excuses. So we were with this idea that this double role of this typological criticism on the one hand, but also the idea that indeed this typological criticism proceeds through the mode of architectural design. Tafuri proposes a sort of criticism that starts from the material, formal, and spatial articulation of an architectural project. That's really what he's saying. And he develops a critical perspective from there. He's literally writing, as you can see on the screen with me, the critical stream we are dealing with takes reality as its starting point and models on it a reading immediately translated into systems that modify its single components, or in extreme cases, its fundamental laws. Indeed, I would say Tafuri points to the quality of an architectural project to deconstruct, scrutinize, and reassemble urban elements and qualities that are thought of as immutable or undisputable. As such, architectural design is given the capacity to confront so-called normal or obvious systems with alternative configurations, forms, and images, thereby placing present architectural solutions in a critical perspective. In typological criticism, Tafuri maintains historical analysis, critical examination, critical function of the image, and the demonstrative value of planning are all indissolubly connected. They're all interconnected. So this is, I hope, let's say, summarizing a bit some of the aspects that I've introduced to you before. In order to grasp the span of Tafuri's concept of typological criticism a little bit better, I would like to, and I promise you this is the last notion, to introduce one more theoretical notion this evening in my lecture, and that is the notion of semi-autonomy, the semi-autonomy of architecture. Which I think can help us to understand this notion of typological criticism even better, I would say. This notion of semi-autonomy of architecture is a notion that was introduced by the French thinker Louis Althusser, who brought this to the fore in his very well-known essay, Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatus of 1970, so shortly published after Tafuri's thinking. And what Althusser is suggesting there is that in this particular essay is that the relationship that the cultural realm, including architecture, that this cultural realm maintains with the economical, social, and political realm can be understood as a semi-autonomous or a relative autonomous relationship. To me, that's a very, very important notion. Semi-autonomy signifies that none of these realms coincides with the other or is completely independent of the others. So the cultural realm, architecture, in relation to the social, economic, and political realm, they have a relation of semi-autonomy, of relative autonomy. For me, it's a very, very important notion to understand. In other words, architecture is not the sheer expression of the social, the political, or the economical matrix from which it emerges, but it's certainly also not disconnected from it. Conversely, architecture develops according to its internal autonomous laws and logics, we can say, but it is never fully disconnected from the heteronomous set of conditions from which it came into being. This is what Althusser is learning us. This is this notion of semi-autonomy. Althusser's viewpoint challenges quite a bit of well-established concepts in architectural discourse and practice. It undermines, for instance, the belief that architecture is the ultimate expression of a certain zeitgeist or of a certain political, social, and economic matrix. Many architectural thinkers have been working with that. I'm showing you here the Weissenhof Siedlung or the Weissenhof estate, where indeed, as you can see, represented by the car, that the architecture and the car, they seem to be part of the same sort of zeitgeist. Althusser is in some kind of way halting that sort of understanding. Since architecture never fully coincides with the social, political, and economic matrix of its time, it can never be the full and perfect expression of that. To me, that's a very important notion. Conversely, at the same time, Althusser's viewpoint destabilizes every claim of a fully autonomous architecture made by neo-rationalist architects, such as Aldo Rossi or Giorgio Grassi, for instance. Indeed, if architectural practice maintains a relation with other practices and realms, it is, we can say, simultaneously autonomous and heteronomous. autonomous because it develops according to its own typological, structural, and material logics, and that belong exclusively to the field of architecture and its history. Heteronomous because architecture is the formal, material, and spatial expression, partially, of economic, social, and political conditions, norms, and constellations. So this is this idea of this relative autonomy. So with what Althusser is bringing us is indeed that he asks us to think a realm as architecture simultaneously as an heteronomous field, so related to ideological, economic, political, and social practices and regimes, and simultaneously as an autonomous domain of aesthetic, structural, and functional logics. And what Althusser is telling us, and I think that this comes very, very close to what Tafuri is telling with typological criticism, that exactly in this capacity to alter between heteronomy and autonomy, the critical function of architecture is located. Exactly in this capacity to be simultaneously part of an heteronomous field and of an autonomous domain. In this capacity, the critical attitude, the critical capacity of architecture resides. To illustrate that, and this is an illustration by Tafuri that I'm showing right now, we can go for one moment back to the Golden Lane project by Elson and Peter Smithson. This is a good case study to illustrate this critical capacity. This project for a housing estate on a bombed neighborhood of London, as you can see to the left-hand side, is obviously a clear criticism of the autonomy of architecture, of modern typologies, of large housing blocks, such as the unité d'habitation as developed by Le Corbusier. The Smithson's position criticized this typology, this autonomy of architecture in a variety of ways. Amongst others, by positioning their streets in the air, not in the middle of the volume, as you can see here, of the unité d'habitation, but at the edge of the volume, offering these streets in the air, as we see here in this sketch by the Smithsons, a direct relation to the urban landscape. So moving the typological entity of the rue intérieure to the perimeter of the building and connecting it to the urban landscape, as we can see, for instance, in this collage that they make, where we see very clearly this rue intérieure here as connected to the urban landscape of London. In addition, the Smithsons introduced various thresholds between the street and the dwelling in the form of little loggias and so on, which create, again, a sort of criticism of the initial unité d'habitation typology by introducing spaces of transition between the public street and the private in the private dwelling. And another sort of criticism that the Smithsons are uttering is that they indeed start to connect the different streets in the air. As you can see on the drawings on the screen right now, the streets in the air are these yellowish indication. And on the drawing to the right, you see how they become indeed bigger urban clusters in the idea of the Smithsons. Thereby, the Smithsons criticize the isolation and disconnection of the interior streets in the original unité. In other words, the Smithsons use their project of the Golden Lane in order to transform and criticize the unité, and thereby offer a sort of very sharp criticism of one of the most canonic architectural typologies of recent architectural history. However, the Golden Lane project was not only a comment on the autonomous developments in recent architectural history, but also a criticism of the heteronomous political, economical, and social characteristics of the urban condition of London, I would argue. Indeed, the Smithsons' proposal for the Golden Lane can be seen as a critical comment on the existing structure of London that consisted of clear social-spatial distinctions between different neighborhoods, creating differences between worker boroughs and upmarket areas in the city of London. The Smithsons clearly juxtapose, as you can see on the screen right now, their clusters of internal streets on the existing structure of the city. On top of the existing urban tissue and public spaces, a new system of interrelated streets in the air is projected. The Smithsons believe that this combination of old and new urban tissue would engender a new spatial system that in turn would accommodate new forms of collectivity and new public domains, irrespective of economical class distinctions. So what I'm trying to get across is that London at that time when the Smithsons were planning was very much a segregated system of workers' boroughs, of upmarket boroughs, and that one of the ways that Tafuri is looking on this project of the Golden Lane by the Smithsons is that they are in some kind of way criticizing these socioeconomic spatial distinctions within the city of London. Hence, when we look at the Smithsons visualizing their collages of the streets of the air that are populated by kids, but also by upscale and upmarket people like Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe, which we see here in this collage. They are all part of a new collectivity. They all participate in the new urban realm. Out of this perspective, the Golden Lane appears as a project that is critical of the class structure that was still present in London in the 1950s. The Golden Lane, I would say, talks back or enters in a dialectic relation as well with the autonomy of architecture, but also with the heteronomy of the urban condition in which the Smithsons were operating. And this is indeed illustrating this critical capacity of typological criticism. This ability to talk back, to offer a critique based on duality, based on this critical capacity of the architectural project, is obviously not something that was a prerogative of the 1950s and the 1960s. I would say quite on the contrary. Also in current practice and thinking, this capacity can, in my mind, play a paramount role. After all, the complexity and the issues that are at stake in our contemporary urban condition, they really, I would say, require architectural and urban projects that surpass mere utilitarian problem solving or surface styling to fulfill other more committed roles. Also today, I would argue the architectural project can get into a dialectic relation with the social, cultural, and political and economic logics of our present urban condition. And I think that architecture's relative autonomy and thus distance vis-à-vis these heteronomous drivers of our present urban condition can allow it to play not only an elucidating, exploratory, but also a critical role. In 1988, the artist Krzysztof Wodiszko illustrated, I think, this capacity one more time with his project for a so-called homeless vehicle, a very minor, I must admit, urban intervention that was inserted in the city of New York. The typology of the tower, the Trump Tower, as you can see on the screen, was at this occasion combined, juxtaposed with the type of the tube or the vehicle. In this comparison, not only the typology of the dwelling in the contemporary city is criticized, but also the understanding of the homeless population as part of the architecture of the city. I would argue that the comparative presence of tower and tube raises once again the collision between architecture as a shelter and architecture as real estate, which creates homelessness as its byproduct. By juxtaposing architectural projects, architecture can talk back to the various social, cultural, political, and economic logics that steer our present urban condition. By making formal, material, and spatial claims in the form of an architectural project, though be it a minor architectural project, designers can touch in a critical way upon a wide variety of heteronomous parameters in the social, cultural, economic, and political fields. Hence, an architectural project, though being formulated in sheer autonomous architectural terms, can be looked upon as a critical hypothesis on complex social and economic matters. It is out of this perspective that architectural projects, while being juxtaposed to existing histories and conditions, have the ability to criticize the complexity of our urban conditions, have the ability to talk back. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for this inspiring lecture. Maybe you can stop sharing screen so we can all see our faces. Thank you. I encourage anyone in the audience to write down at the chat any questions he or she might like to ask. And in the meanwhile, I'm gonna put some thoughts on your lecture. Tafuri's writings and ideas deal mainly with the definition of the task of the critic or historian, not that of the architect. And therefore, many of the processes he describes are not so easily applicable to the field of action of architecture itself, because of the problem of a lack of distance. And at the same time, critique can be claimed as a creative activity, as Sven Olof Wallenstein suggested in the lecture yesterday. So if, as it seems, you're refraining typological criticism as a means of action, of intervention, confronting reality, my question would be, what is your position in relation to the operative character of criticism, not just as an aftermath of architecture, but as a triggering device? I mean, who has the right and the authority to attribute a critical status to an architectural project or work amid this pervasive claim of criticality? Because of course the architect can have a distance from the historical development of the type, but not from the work itself.
That's thanks for a very interesting set of questions, Sylvia, because I think you're asking
it's a hard one,
several questions, but they really go to the heart of what I wanted to get across, and they also maybe offer me the opportunity to elaborate a bit on what I wanted to say. It is true, of course, that Tafuri himself was a historian critic, let's say, but what I find indeed very interesting in this notion of typological criticism is that he's trying to locate the critical activity in the design activity, let's say. I mean, we can discuss, so that's really what he's trying to say. He's looking at all of these architects that I named, the Smithsons, Giancarlo De Carlo, Jeffrey Copcutt, all of these architects that were making projects at that very moment, actually at the very moment that he was writing, and suggesting to us that these architects, they have the capacity, maybe within the very limited register in which they work, namely they are designers, they are designing projects, let's say, that they have within this relatively limited register the possibility to develop a critical attitude. A critical attitude, which is on the one hand the critical attitude vis-à-vis their own history, the history of indeed types, forms, materials, and so on, but also a critical attitude vis-à-vis indeed the conditions in which architecture emerges, let's say, which are social, political, economical condition. And what I really, let's say, admire in this, as it were, in this notion of typological criticism is that Tafuri is trying to locate within the very design activity this possibility of developing a critical stance, and both let's say this critical stance vis-à-vis architecture's own autonomy or own autonomy and own history, and vis-a-vis these heteronomous conditions, let's say, they have to do with establishing a certain kind of dialectic, let's say. And that's why I also wanted to bring this notion to this conference, because I think that central to this conference, as far as I understood it, was indeed this idea of a certain dialectic move, let's say. And I think that that's, for me, very, very important. The critical question that you are asking, Sylvia, is of course the question which Tafuri unfolds in the same book, namely the question of operativity, of operative criticism, let's say. And that's of course a very difficult question to ask, because it's almost a bit of an ideological question, obviously, as well. What I think is extremely important there is that I think that this question of operative criticism is a question for the critic, I would say. I mean, is a question for the critic and the historian. And what I think that Tafuri is trying to do with this notion of typological criticism is that he's trying to keep this activity of criticism, let's say, in some kind of way, trying to open it for designers, trying to open it for practitioners, as it were, as well. And I must say that I appreciate that very, very strongly. So I would like to, maybe, if I may, for the moment, stay a bit away of your question of operative criticism. But of course, I mean, Sylvia, what is a very important question is of who has the agency to do this. But I see what I like about it, because Tafuri is naming a list of architects. I mean, don't only think about avant-garde architects. I mean, I only picked a few of well-known names like the Smithsons, like Giancarlo De Carlo, like Rossi. But Tafuri is naming many, many more architects who are all, in his opinion, illustrating this practice, I would say, of typological criticism. So it's not as exclusive as you maybe would think in the first place. I don't know if this is really an answer.
Oh, of course. I guess the brackets in the title, in the word impossibilities in the title of your lecture would have to disappear, because you're quite optimistic about the critical capacities of the project. I think we could all agree on that. But I was referring maybe the impossibilities is the very claim of criticality by the architect. Yeah. I mean, you need kind of external agent that legitimates that criticality.
Well,
you're like a little bit stuck there.
Yeah, and that's Sylvia, something. For instance, I remember that people like Rossi or so, they were saying, well, actually, the architect can't really take a critical position because it's only given to them, only when it's given to them. But I think that what Tafuri is doing is more interesting, because he's suggesting that even while you work in your autonomous, one more time, when you work in your autonomous realm of forms, of types, of materials, that there is a possibility, because of this semi-autonomy of architecture, to reach out to political, economical, social questions as well. So it doesn't necessarily needs to be given to you, even when you work in this realm of forms, materials. Because of the semi-autonomy, there is, in my mind, this possibility. I know it's optimistic. I fully agree.
You struck an optimist from Tafuri, which is a great achievement.
Yeah, but I do think that's what he's suggesting. I honestly believe that's what he's suggesting. Let's.
Thank you. I think it was just to cause a little bit of debate. I don't know if the people who have write the questions, do you want me to read them, or maybe you will feel more comfortable just speaking out loud?
Yeah, well, thanks. First of all, thank you for the people who typed very lengthy questions. I can see. I can maybe Yeah, they believe that critique through the type rather than through the urban would be more within the reach of architects today. Do you see a relationship between? So somebody is asking me, if I may quickly summarize, is if this insistence on type, let's say, differs from other sorts of urban critique relating, for instance, to Henri Lefebvre, I see here as well. The reason why I wanted to bring this focus on type is because I believe, with the risk of repeating myself, I believe that it's important that we try to think about ways of doing criticism that are very, very close to the field of the designer. I mean, we all know, of course, that Henri Lefebvre was a great critic, but we also know that he was a sociologist. And when he was speaking about space, for instance, I mean, many people have shown that. I think we all know that the conception of space with Lefebvre, though it was a very interesting space, it's not necessarily a very interesting conception, is not necessarily the conception of space that architects hold of space. They are related. There are very interesting overlaps, but there are also they diverge. Let's say as well. And what I've tried to do today is to search, let's say, a way of operating, of doing critique, let's say, that is very, very close to the toolbox, if I may say so, of the designer. And that was the interest for me. But of course, they are interrelated. I mean, I think if I would say, then I would say that the critique of somebody like Lefebvre very much starts from the heteronomy, what I would call the heteronomy of architecture. It starts from the political, the social, the economic condition, let's say. And from there, it formulates a critique on more autonomous occurrences in the urban territory, for instance. And I think that that's, of course, a very valid critique. And as we know, we all love the thinking of Lefebvre, and now for 5-6 decades, Lefebvre continues to inspire us to think about the city. And I think, well, many of by this thinking of Lefebvre, but at the same time, it's also a thinking that starts at least relatively far away from our discipline. And what I try to do today is to start as close as I could from our discipline. But I do believe that there are points of encounter. Obviously, at a certain point, claims that are more on the autonomy, on the spatial occurrence of the city of Paris or of the housing estates around Paris. So I think there are relations, but I think they, in my mind at least, they start from very different points of entry. That to me is very important. But I do think that they can enter into to a certain dialogue. Yeah, I do believe that. So that was from, okay. Well, also a question that Akemi asked, I think. Yeah. Well, should be, it's difficult to, Michael Sorkin, who passed away. How can resistance destabilize manipulation, be both liberating and creative? Yeah. It's big questions that Marina Correa is asking. I think it's very good questions. But it's very big questions that you are asking. Of course, we need to realize that technology, just to focus on the end quote that Marina is saying about recognizing that technology is socially produced and never neutral. I couldn't agree more with that. I think obviously technology is socially produced, and that I think is the quality of this notion of semi-autonomy or relative autonomy. I think that this is very, very helpful for us as architects, that we start to understand that we don't need to say, well, technology is fully socially produced or is fully autonomous. Architecture is fully socially produced or is fully autonomous, in other words, but that we can position ourselves in the middle of that spectrum, and that we understand that technology or architecture is partially social produced and partially autonomous. The technology is partially socially produced, and partially autonomous. I think that that's the rich understanding. So I'm not in favor of a completely autonomous understanding of architecture, nor in favor of a completely, as many sociologists or social geographers have done, locating architecture as something that is completely produced within, let's say, a social, political, economical regime. I'm in favor of a sort of middle position, of a middle understanding, and that's what this semi-autonomy is able to bring us. And to be very honest, I think that that's also what Tafuri is pointing to when he was talking about typological criticism, this capacity to be simultaneously in these, as it were, two fields, or in these two domains. There is one question that I like from Marco Salazar, so I'll answer that one, and that is the question of: do you think that the role of research done by architects should recover an operative ambition? I can say yes. I mean, this sounds maybe. I'm somebody who is busy with research in the field of history and theory, as many of you might know. And of course, for a very long time, and this brings me back to one of the questions that Sylvia asked, for a very long time, it has been said that you shouldn't do operative history or operative theory. Let's say that was something where you, if you really wanted to do theoretical research, if you really wanted to do historical research, you should stay far away from that. I think that still many of my colleagues believe that. And I'm starting to think more and more that this is where the real goal of history and theory should lie nowadays, that we should become almost as operative as possible, I would say. I think that there are so many, let's say, challenging questions that are in front of us in terms of the current urban condition, in terms of how we understand architectural culture, that I think all of research should become operative research right now. This sounds a bit radical and a bit strange, maybe, but for instance, we are doing at ETH right now, for instance, a lot of historical research on the commons. To give you one example, this research on the commons is historical research. We look back to the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th century, and the 20th century, obviously, but we do that in order to propel a contemporary debate. So we become, in that sense, you could say, very operative. As said, I mean, many of my colleagues will criticize me right now, will say, this is not serious historical or theoretical research that you're doing. But I have the feeling more and more that this operative dimension is an extremely important dimension for the field of architecture. Given in the condition that we are in, I think we need to do research which brings us to a better understanding of our contemporary condition. That should be, I think, one of the main ambitions, let's say. So this would be a little let's say, response to Marco Salazar. There is also a very nice question about of Carlos Eduardo, who's asking about what about the connection between the Pedregulho housing in Rio and the Golden Lane. That's of course a beautiful question. Also there, I mean, I always understood what the Pedregulho is doing as, on the one hand, a criticism of the idea of neighborhood units, of these sort of ideas that belong to the autonomy of architecture. But at the same time, I've also always understood it as a criticism of the condition of workers in Rio de Janeiro, an attempt to create housing, affordable housing, a good place to live, close to the workplace. And when I'm thinking about what particularly Carmen Portinho did of planning these housing estates in these particular urban conditions, I'm also understanding that as a criticism, I would say, of the current, but current understood as in the 60s condition of 50s and 60s in Rio de Janeiro, and the long travels that people had to do between the place where they were living and the place where they were working. So I would say that also such a project like the Pedregulho is, in that sense, a sort of typological criticism, obviously, in many ways.
Or maybe just to close, I would like to elaborate a little bit with about the other concept you were mentioning, the semi-autonomy concept, which I find quite liberating for us, because in a way it's a way of not answering this question posed in dichotomic structure, and you just don't have to answer. I mean, why do you think it's and has been so important for the discipline, this debate, recurrent debate we are struggling with about the limits of our own discipline? Because facts has shown us that we can operate completely independent of the answer we give to this question. So why are we so concerned with this question when other disciplines don't even think of it?
The question of where we locate
what are our limits, what are boundaries, and do we stand in, out, in the core, in the periphery? We are always with this kind of
To me, one more time, I mean, actually it is, I could only touch upon the notion in a lecture like this one, but I've been writing about this notion of semi-autonomy already a bit more in some of the articles that I've been publishing some years ago right now. So I really would invite all of you to look at this, because I think it is a very important notion. I would have, I think, Sylvia, two answers to what you were asking. On the one hand, I think the answer is maybe a very cynical answer. That is that as architects, I think we are losing our role in society. And that is the fact that we connect to this debate is one way to try to define, okay, where are we? Where do we stand? It's sort of indeed the last convulsions of an already half dead body, let's say, or a body that is being marginalized, let's say, reduced to beautifiers, reduced to, I mean, I could say many things, but we know this discourse. So I think part of our search is really about that. I mean, how have we as a discipline been marginalized, and how can we maybe start to think a position again, let's say, and understand our activity as a societally relevant activity. The other answer would be that we have, of course, in our culture had very extreme positions. Let's say positions where people have said architecture is all about autonomy. Think about the whole neo-rationalist school, in Spain, in France, in Italy. We know that very well in the south of Europe. This has, of course, been a very strong, and not only in the south of Europe, also in Germany, other places. In Switzerland has been a very strong school of thinking, let's say. And on the other hand, of course, we've seen, I think, inspired by theories from sociology, social geography, political theory, many people, I would say in the 1990s, around the 2000s, who started to think architecture as the complete expression of political, economical regimes, let's say. I must say, I was also a bit... how should I say that? I mean, a bit affronted by these extreme positions that were taking at the time. I remember that still at the time, in for instance, the debates in the 90s, where extreme positions were taking. Architecture is autonomous was one part of the debate. No, architecture is all about politics and economy. This was the neoliberalization and financialization, as we are currently saying, on the other side. And I think, to reduce our discipline to these very extreme points of view, I don't think is very helpful. Let's say, I don't think it's bringing us forward as a discipline. It's only, let's say, returning us to very extreme and, to my idea, not so interesting positions, let's say, or they're interesting because of their extremities, but they're not interesting in that they bring us forward, because they are too extreme to really become to really propel us forward in my mind. And so that's why I'm remain so interested in this notion of relative or semi-autonomy. And I said, I mean, the argument is much more complex than what I could tell today in a simple lecture. But if anybody of you wants to read something, I have been thinking a bit more complexly about this as well, because it is a fantastic capacity to work in a discipline that is semi-autonomous, let's say, that allows for a lot of operations, a lot of actions, and I would say also a lot of criticality.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for your answers that have been quite challenging. And well, after this great lecture and final debate, I'm afraid it's time to close the conference. Well, along these 2 days, when listening to the authors presenting their contributions and then trying to reframe their arguments in the light of the questions raised during the debates, I just thought how important is the conversation format, and how necessary it is to keep on generating these encounters between researchers. In the name of both schools, Leandro Medrano and myself, we want to thank once more all participants, keynote speakers, and moderators of the debates for their work and trust. And of course, I want to congratulate all members of the organizing committee for what has been an impeccable online event. And we hope you have enjoyed the conference and are looking forward to see you in the next edition of Critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was perfect.
So